We have a very interesting program today, as I mentioned. Our speaker today, Dr. Isaac Eliashar, was born in Jerusalem in 1936. In 1954, he joined the Israeli Air Force. After the 1956 war, he started medical school and graduated in 1963. In 1963, he resumed his military service and was soon promoted to senior flight surgeon. In 1968, he was nominated as Department Surgeon General of Northern Israel. In 1975, he was nominated as Divisional Surgeon. His medical career includes extensive training in head and neck surgery. That's got a real technical name. I'm not even going to try it. You can tell us what it is later. He joined the Cleveland Clinic Foundation as section head in 1984. He holds 2 full professorships in academic medicine in the United States, and currently, although he is retired, he spends a great deal of his time teaching history. Our volunteers all attend a class when they start. They go with their professor, Dr. Isaac Eliashar, learning all about the history of the aircraft and the wars they were involved with. Him and his cohort, Jerry Sweeney, conduct those classes and have done so for a number of years, and they do an outstanding job. Please welcome our speaker today, Dr. Isaac Eliashar.
Good morning, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be, how should I say, looking at such a great, large audience, which means that you're interested in history. In these days when we are all experiencing issues with the teaching of history in our academic and even lower schools, and we have to remember the history, because if you don't remember history, the bad things in history will repeat themselves. Now, I am going to talk about the Battle of Midway. Battle of Midway is one of the turning points of World War II. I will try to get you into the battle itself and explain to you why it happened, how it happened, and how lucky we were that it happened and it ended the way it did. Okay? There's a sort of saying in sports, that racing sports in particular, that luck is a point where practice and opportunity meet. And this is the most correct description of what happened, and where luck was really a play the game in this battle of Midway. So remember that saying, because it will mean a lot as we go on. This is the island of Midway, a little tiny, really tiny speck on the globe, approximately in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, 12,000 miles from the American shoreline and about 2,500 miles from Japan. It is part of an archipelago of a chain of islands that extends for 1,600 miles from Hawaii to where it is. Okay? And it is a tiny little island, but there's something unique about it. It's one of the only islands in the area that can accommodate a base, that can accommodate an airfield. And here it is essentially a coral reef that is like a ring that surrounds 2 small islands with an entrance for ships to go in, not large ships, but relatively medium ships and so on. In 1940, before America joined the Allies, in other words, Britain, at that point, that was the only country that was actually fighting against the Germans, Roosevelt realized that chances are that we will have to fight the Japanese, and started reinforcing and building the island as a military base. World War II in the Pacific is essentially something that most of you know about. I can see your age, I can see your interest, I've spoken to many people can teach me. So I don't have to go into all the details. But we'll try to sort of just look into why did Japan attack Midway. And here is, and I hope that you can see that, here is a picture or a map of the Pacific, and the same map is on the wall over there. So you can go back and sort of rehash it and try to sort of re-explain it to yourselves. And you have to remember, Japan became an imperialistic country way back in the beginning of the 20th century, even before that. And it became so imperialistic that it threatens the whole Pacific area, and it was just waiting to grab whatever it could. And here we go. This is the Japanese ambition to take over the whole Far East. And in 1931, they took over Manchuria and established a puppet state called Manchukuo. 1937, they attacked China and started trying to literally conquer all of China. However, Chiang Kai-shek, supported by the United States, stopped them. In other words, curtailed their activities, and they did not like that. They were really furious at the United States. They left the United Nations. They became the bad guy of the Pacific at that time. 1939, they tried to invade Russia. But General Zhukov, which was the great general that beat the Germans in the Eastern Front of World War II, beat them to the pulp. And they had to sign a truce with the Russians, a truce that the Russians insisted on, which essentially guaranteed that there will not be war between Japan and Russia for 10 years. Okay? 1940, Japan looked at the world and saw that Hitler, within less than 6 months, conquered all of Europe. And they are planning to conquer all of the Far East. And it's a wonderful opportunity. He conquered all of Europe, and the empires of Europe, France, Belgium, Holland, Britain, are in deep, how shall I call it, trouble. And thank you. I don't know why you're laughing. Anyway, in deep trouble, which means that their colonies are like fruit to be plucked from the tree, ready, because they can't defend them. So the first action that they do, they join the Axis. They join Hitler and Mussolini. Next thing that they do, they essentially get into trouble with the United States, because the United States at this point was serious about what is going to happen and the repercussions of these potential ambitions in the Pacific, and it actually imposed sanctions on the Japanese. Not only that, FDR advanced the Pacific Navy from its main base in San Diego to Pearl Harbor. And that did not work well with the Japanese, because it was clearly a threat. Next thing, they started really trying to overcome Chiang Kai-shek's resistance and did not succeed, again because of America's help. The next thing they did was they invaded Indochina, which is Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, as you know. And why did they invade that country? Because this was the route in which America at the time, and Britain, but predominantly America, helped Chiang Kai-shek. There's a route that runs all along Vietnam, all the way into China, and it was the main supply line at that time. It was still before World War II, in other words, America's involvement in World War II. And essentially, this was their ambition, to block American support. America imposed a total ban on trade with Japan, which means that Japan, being dependent on America for 80% of its oil, could not have oil. Japan has no oil, has no commodities, and that is why they wanted to get to all these countries which have oil commodities and everything, from rubber to oil to iron ore to food to a market to slaves, actually, because that was their plan. Next, they attacked Pearl Harbor. Why did they attack Pearl Harbor? Because they realized that the only power that stands in their way to conquer all this was the United States. And they immediately, on the same day, attacked Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and so on and so forth. In other words, they literally marched into, and within days to months, within 6 months, they were in control of all these islands. The Philippines stood for about 6 months, but they were in control of the Philippines. The Americans just fought, but essentially it was a losing battle, as you know. Japan, this is the final Japan. I wanted to wake you up. This is Japan's final barrier. This is the border which they reached. I will not do that again, don't worry. At least I'm not planning to. Anyway, at this point, they are threatening Australia, and they are in a position to extend their, can you see the pointer? Extend their forces to here, the Suez Canal, to the Middle East, to get oil from the oil-rich countries, oil resources of the Middle East. So they start advancing their forces, and they're trying to get to Ceylon, an island next to India, the tip of India. If they would have gotten Ceylon, Churchill said that would be the end of the war. Because from there, they would march into the Persian Gulf, into the Suez Canal. At the same time, Rommel was attacking the Suez Canal from the west. You all know that? Yes? No? Well, now you know. And it was a possibility that the axis would be sort of closed over as a chain around the whole world. They sunk the British ships. At that point, there were no more British ships in the Far East. And in April of 18th of 1942, America surprised them. That was the Doolittle attack. Now, the Doolittle attack was insignificant from a military point of view. However, what it did do, it brought about the return of the big Japanese Navy from its plans to attack Ceylon and advance westwards back to the homeland, to the home islands. Why? Because the Japanese could not tolerate the possibility that their islands, their homeland, would be attacked. They had to defend their homeland. At that point, we also achieved something which is great. America broke their code system, their military, their naval code system, and discovered that they are planning, that Yamamoto is planning to attack northern Australia. And Nimitz knew that, knew the very details, and he sent 2 aircraft carriers with their supporting battleships to meet the Japanese. The Japanese tried to get the control of a port in New Guinea, which they could use as a stepping stone to invade Australia, which had no protection at the time because most of its soldiers were in Italy and in North Africa. Did you know that? Now you know. Nimitz comes in, they clash, and this was the Battle of the Coral Sea. Tactically, the Battle of the Coral Sea was almost even. The Japanese lost a small aircraft carrier, but had very severe damage to 2 other main aircraft carriers. The Americans lost a big carrier, the Lexington, and it was sunk, and there was damage to the Yorktown. And if you'll ask me later, if we'll have time, I'll tell you why the damage to the Yorktown was not significant, because of luck and perseverance and good management of its deck, which is very interesting. So at this point, the Japanese have 4 out of 6 aircraft carriers. The Americans, according to the Japanese, have only 2 aircraft carriers. The Yorktown is damaged, then most probably, according to their estimation, out of function. It's not, it cannot function, and has to be repaired for maybe months. And Hornet and the Enterprise are the only aircraft carriers available. So it's 4 against 2. Nevertheless, Japan maintained its belief, whichever way, that future carrier operations against the United States will and are bound to succeed. Because they had the experience, they had the numbers, they had the better pilots, they had excellent planes, they had excellent, doctrine in using them, and the Americans were not very experienced, and obviously they saw it in the Battle of Battle of the Coral Straits, and they also realized that in every encounter that they had. So Yamamoto, the man that led the attack on Pearl Harbor, is now deciding what to do next. This man said that after Pearl Harbor, he will run for 6 months. At the end of 6 months, the American giant will awake. This is the point of the 6 months. Yamamoto had to stop the Americans now. This was his last opportunity. He has 4, we have 2 aircraft carriers, and so on and so on. America had this relatively small fleet in comparison to the Japanese, and this was, the decision was, of all the opportunities that he had, the list of opportunities, this where he was. He chose Midway. Why did he choose Midway? Again, because of that little attack, the Doolittle attack, which had only one explanation to the Japanese, that where did those bombers take off from? Most probably from Midway. Not only that, Midway was in the midway of the Pacific Ocean, close, relatively close, 1,000 plus miles from Hawaii. If you get that, Midway, you can lead on to Hawaii, and from Hawaii, the whole American coast will be yours if you succeed in destroying, first of all, the American aircrafts and the American Navy. You will have, and America will literally collapse. And they didn't want to conquer America, but they did want to reach an agreement with America, a consensus, a truce, a ceasefire, which will allow them to take over the empire that they already had, to keep it. Yamamoto, this is all happening within days. You have to understand, Yamamoto had no time. He realized this has to be done now. June 1942, Yamamoto put together a plan which he had ready of assembling the history's largest fleet that has been assembled ever in history. It had 4 aircraft carriers, and it was intended to invade, literally, land forces on Midway. A diversionary raid to the Aleutian Islands, to Alaska, was planned to divert the American fleet, towards Alaska, so that Midway would not be prepared, maybe not at all, or to a lesser degree. The decisive naval battle that will ensue here would bring about destruction of the America's what they thought only 2 remaining aircraft carriers, and it would lead to the battle between the remaining battleships of the United States Navy, those that survived Pearl Harbor. You with me? And will open the road for a negotiation with America. Japan's tide of good fortunes was destined to be reversed at this point. And why? Significantly because of America's code-breaking expertise. And this was hard work and dedication which they deserve, because they actually provided the information for Midway to turn out as it did. And the person that actually did the job and actually went beyond just getting information, he actually did more research and found out more details. He was Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort. They succeeded in decrypting all the Japanese messages. They knew exactly what the Japanese were planning. They knew where and when and how. They knew every detail except one. Where? Where are they going to attack? Is it in the Panama Canal? Is it in Alaska? Is it in Los Angeles? Is in who knows where? Why just that little island, Midway? And it had to be confirmed, because we're talking about the Pacific Ocean. If you literally concentrate in one area, all the rest is open. And in other words, the big Japanese Navy could have been really all over the place. And America had very few, little, concentrated, limited forces. So Rochefort actually gave the Japanese a bait. He asked the communication officers in Midway to send out an encrypted message, knowing that the Japanese will decipher it, that we have no water, the water system is broken, to the main base at Pearl Harbor. Within less than a day, the Japanese ordered their ships to take water with them because there's no water in Midway. That was the confirmation. Now we know everything, when, where, what, and predominantly where. The attack is going to be on June 3rd at night or early in the morning of June 4th against Midway. This was the single most valuable intelligence contribution to the entire Pacific War. Nimitz took it seriously and immediately prepared a surprise. The Japanese wanted to have a trap for the Americans. Now the Americans are in a position to trap the Japanese. Knowing what the assault was, that the assault was to come on June 3rd, 1943, the United States Navy undertook urgent, intensive preparatory measures. The atoll, the Midway Atoll, was fortified and reinforced. And these are pictures of the map, or the crude map of the reinforcement. You can imagine everything that could be done was done within the limited period. Marines were transferred and planes were transferred. And standing by on Midway by June 3rd, 1942, a total of 126 planes were already, ready for action there. Many of these planes, we have some of them in this hall, and in particular, the SBD is right there behind you. These were planes that actually were the best that we had at the time. The pilots were the best available at the time. Many of them were new. Many of them were already obsolete. Almost all were flown by inexperienced pilots. It was, again, inexperience is a relative statement, not enough experience, if we'll call it that way. And again, here's the SBD behind you. I just want to give you a little bit, but you'll get much more by the time I finish. Navy scout plane and a dive bomber. Essentially, it was one of the best planes that served the American Navy throughout the Pacific War. And it was essentially fortunate, in spite of the dangerous role that it played, to have the lowest loss ratio of all the other planes that actually took part in the Pacific War. Okay? Hawaii, May 28, 1948. We are about 10 days from the expected clash, all right? A Task Force 16, which essentially is 2 aircraft carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet are taking off towards Midway. And they are passing by what the Japanese were supposed to establish, a sort of surveillance system of submarines and seaplanes that would detect the movement of the American forces throughout the whole preparatory phases of the attack. And they failed. The Japanese failed to notice their movement or their transfer. They were only about 2 carriers, 6 cruisers, 9 destroyers that would confront not less than 90 Japanese big warships in that war. That is essentially midgets trying to encounter or resist or fight giants. The slow battleships, American battleships, remained back to the east towards the American coastline to protect the coastline in the event that the battle would fail for America. May 30th, in an amazing feat of dockyard efficiency, Yorktown, showing slight signs of hasty repair, left Pearl Harbor to join the fleet in close to the Midway Island. The dockyard said it would take 3 months to repair. It took 3 days. And naturally, they didn't do it. It was a good job, but they did a good job. The Yorktown was ready to fight. And again, Yorktown was accompanied by 2 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Definitely not a big force to sort of even consider as a match to the Japanese. Okay, let's talk about the battle. Are you still with me?
Yes.
Anybody asleep?
No.
If you are, please stand up. Nobody. Okay. Now, can you see this? Are you okay with that? This is Pearl Harbor. This is sort of just to indicate where the Japanese were trying to identify the movements, detect the movements of the American fleet. This is a seaplane. They found some islands in the area that they could hide, and they thought that they would use it. They failed, and this was not effective. The Japanese submarines were not effective, and the American fleet succeeded in 2 phases to reach what was called Point Luck and establish themselves ready northeast of Midway to counter the Japanese onslaught. Right? Here are the plans now. The Kido Butai is the name of the joint combined Japanese fleet. 4 carriers and the biggest aircraft carriers in the world at the time, the biggest, not only that, the biggest warships at the time, with the biggest cannons, the biggest range, absolutely, and more than anything else, with experience. So, the first thing they did was attack the Aleutian Islands. They did a big bombing attack, and they conquered 2 or 3 islands. They encountered some resistance from the Americans. The Americans played the game with them. In other words, they actually gave them the impression that they are being lured towards that area, that Americans are being lured towards that area. And next comes the big Kido Butai, in other words, the big fleet of the aircraft carriers, coming in through the northern part of the Pacific, which was very, how should I say, stormy, particularly during that period, and there was like a cloud over cover that did not make it possible for aircraft to find them out, and they could really show up out of the storm by Midway. Very well planned in that respect. I promised you, but I don't keep my promises. These are the aircraft carriers. And in addition to that, there were 3 more fleets, one of them the invasion fleets that was carrying Japanese Marines, and a support fleet, and another fleet carrying predominantly supplies. And what do you think they really did have? Water. And finally, the big arrow here, or the thick arrow here, is Yamamoto himself with the battleships waiting for the island to be taken, for the aircraft carriers, the Japanese aircraft carriers, to destroy the American aircraft carriers, and then take over the island, and then chase the rest of the American fleet, wherever it is, destroy it, and then offer the Americans a ceasefire and negotiations. And here, this is the picture of the Yamato, which was at the time the biggest battleship in the world, and there were 2 of them. The Musashi was the second one. Both of them were in that huge fleet. All this is under strict radio control. Yamato did not anticipate meeting significant American forces. First of all, now there are 3 aircraft carriers. But there's another aircraft carrier, and that's Midway. And that's an aircraft carrier that you cannot sink. And that's an aircraft carrier that can launch big planes, such as B-17s, such as the Catalina, okay, which we have here. So now you understand what was the significance of this. This is a big surprise. Yamamoto is actually walking with his 2 feet into a trap. The airfield at Midway gave the United States some level of parity with in the forthcoming battle. Both sides depended on scouting aircrafts and submarines. Now, the Japanese had a policy, a military policy, that the scouts, the surveying planes, will not take part or space and will not involve in the activity of the fighting aircraft carriers. They were launched by catapults from cruisers and battleships. That was a big mistake, because that means that the scouting planes, okay, are very small. And if they're small, they are very sensitive to the weather. And they cannot fly high or they cannot fly low, and and their range is small, about maximum 600 miles, which means 300 miles one way, 300 miles backwards. That was nothing. America's planes and scouts were different, and we'll show it them here. The bottom line is here, the key of the victory over the enemy depended on the first to locate and the first to strike. And America had the actual, how shall I call it, advantage here. Here's the Catalina, you have it outside, and it was a robust plane. It had a crew of 9, that means 18 eyes. On the Japanese, at best they had 4 eyes to look at for the enemy, okay? Make a big difference. And they also could be armed. They could actually bomb their targets. And the B-17, I don't have to tell you about that. The B-17 at that time had a range of 2,000 miles. So it's more than 3 times what the Japanese had. Now the battle. And here we come. Are you ready for the battle?
Yeah.
Okay, my wife tells me never to do these things, but that reminds me of a joke that a professor is sitting in the class, and he sees that the back row, several of the listeners are not listening. In other words, they're asleep. So he tells one of his students, "Go wake them up." And the student gets up and says, "Professor, you've put them to sleep. Now you get them up." Okay, so I got you up, I think. All right. So the distance in the battles were huge. We know that already. And the way that each side implemented their search and surveillance plan would naturally be critical. There was no radar, or the radar was very weak at that time. There definitely was no GPS. There was satellite cameras. There was nothing at that time. What you saw is what there was, okay? And here is what a little picture of what a pilot would see if he was flying above or in the clouds, and from in a window he could see, ooh, there is a plane, a boat there, and it would be masked by the wind and masked by the smoke and masked by the weather and so on, and he would not even be able, unless he was really close and in danger of being hit by the defense system of the boat, from being shot down. As expected, June 3rd, my birthday, at 9 in the evening, the first Midway-based PBYs and B-17s detected the enemy. As expected. That was a real, how should I say, when that happened, the command centers and all the boats in the American boats was really elated, because that means we are in the right place, ready to attack them. It was not the actual fighting flotilla. This was the supplies, okay, the more southern ones. And nevertheless, they were attacked by B-17s and PBYs, and that was 700 to 600 miles west of Midway. And also there were submarines in the area. Most of the submarines were not active. They did not fire until later. One actually fired, but the reason was because they were monitoring the movements of the Japanese. No hits. They were bombed. The Japanese were bombed by these planes, by the Catalinas and the B-17s, but they achieved no hits. June 4th, 1942, and essentially 30 minutes after midnight, this is already June 4th, the Japanese were hit by B-17s. They were not hit. They were bombed, but they were not hit. Not a single bomb reached or hit its target. Very, very, very frustrating. At 1 a.m. on June 4th, 1942, a Japanese oil tanker sustained a torpedo hit from a PBY, that's a Catalina, flying boat. This would be, and listen, this is really sad, this would be the only successful air-launched torpedo attack by the United States during the entire battle. And the Catalina was shot down. 4:30, from this point on, red indicates Japanese, blue, Americans. 4:30 on June a.m., on June 4th, 1942, Nagumo, the commanding officers of the carrier task force, four carriers, launched his initial attack on Midway Atoll. 36 of each, bombers, fighter planes, and Zero fighters, and torpedo fighters, and essentially these torpedo fighters were carrying not torpedoes but explosive bombs to destroy the fortifications on the island. He also launched a combat air patrol, which is an umbrella to cover his flotilla. And 8 searching aircraft scouts to spot and find if there's any enemy around. In other words, where are the Americans? Okay? At this point, they did not know where the American aircrafts were, where the American forces were. They thought that they were heading for Alaska. One spotter, and it happened to be, this is luck, it happened to be the spotter that was intended to fly to Point Luck, to where the American aircraft carriers are. One spotter was delayed. There was a problem with the launching system on the cruiser from which it was supposed to be launched, catapult. This in general means too few aircraft laboring in poor weather and already a weak segment, a weak link. The area that was most important was not covered properly. These are the planes. 4:45 a.m. The strike flight against Midway finishes launching, and headed for the island. I want you just to notice, it took the Japanese about 20 minutes to get all the 100+ planes together, ready to fly over to Midway. It took the Americans more than an hour to do the same. No, that's essentially no experience and no, how shall I say, capabilities. The Americans did not have that, how shall I call it, working system that the Japanese had. Nagumo brought his reserve bombers in at this point, because his decks were free, his reserve bombers, all armed with torpedoes and armor-penetrating bombs, in the event that an American carrier will be found, or American carriers will be in the area. And he was waiting for the scouts to notify him. By the way, during this time, and you have to realize, from Nagumo to Midway, about an hour and a half. You have to wait. This is not happening within minutes. This is happening, it's just waiting, and you sit by the radio and you just wait to see what is going on. You can't see the enemy. Midway radar identified the incoming enemy, scrambled all its planes that were still on the ground, and by 6, most of Midway fighter planes stayed close by to provide overhead protection to the island. Others proceeded without air cover, without escorts, fighter escorts, towards the Japanese fleet. They knew where they were. They headed towards the Japanese fleet to attack them. I'm using this map throughout the presentation from this on, and essentially this is Midway. This is Nagumo, this is the Japanese fleet. Yamamoto's fleet is somewhere here, waiting, okay? So sailing slowly, keeping distance. And this is Point Luck. This is where the 3 American aircraft carriers are. We together? Friends? Still friends? Okay. At 6 in the morning, 16 B-17s are going to attack the wrong flotilla, the supply lines. They're told, no, you go in that direction and change course. 6:15, a battle in the air occurs between the defense fighters, the interceptors of Midway, and the escorts of the Japanese flotilla coming to attack. Their mission is to attack Midway. And the Americans lose. The Japanese are better. Most of the American interceptors were shot down. They succeeded in bringing down some of the Japanese bombers, but it was a losing battle. At the same time, the Yorktown is bringing back its scouts. There's no need to have the scouts anymore. These scouts are essentially SPDs. Arming them with bombs that would penetrate a armored plate, in other words, a ship, and getting ready to launch them against the Japanese flotilla. 6:35, the Japanese raid over Midway begins, and it was literally a lost battle. They really destroyed everything in sight. They bombed, they strafed, they bombed again, and they actually were almost free except for good anti-aircraft firing by the Marines. Many of them died or got injured in the process. And this is one of the pictures of Midway at that point. 7 in the morning, Lieutenant Commander Tomonaga, the commander of the Japanese fleet, planes that attacked Midway, starts flying back and reports, we've done the job, but sorry, the island is not completely ready for our invasion. The Americans are still strong enough to resist, and we have to send another attack. At that point, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown are putting together as many planes as they can and planning an all-out attack on the 4 Japanese carriers. The problem was that they were not used to working together, they were not coordinated, and it took more than an hour to arrange the squadrons to fly towards the target. Bad situation. It already doesn't seem good. 6:30 to 7:10 in the morning. The American Midway-born planes, bombers, torpedo bombers, B-25s, or 26 actually, and that were not intended to use torpedoes, flew over and got within range of the Japanese, started an attack. They were literally decimated, annihilated by the Zeros, the cap, okay, that umbrella that protected the aircraft carriers. Literally decimated. And no loss, no hits, not a single scratch to the Japanese fleet. Are you with me? This is tragedy. No hits. 7:15. Nagumo was heartened. He's happy by the seeming invincibility of his force. This is amazing. Having not had contact reports from the scout planes, he thought that he can now continue functioning on a different course. He supposed that an obligatory second aerial attack on Midway Island was achievable because there's no American aircraft carrier in the area, and it is justified because otherwise it will be very hard for the landing forces to take the island. And he makes a decision which is not what he was supposed to. He orders his reserve fighter planes that were sitting on the deck, okay, ready to fly, armed with anti-ship armor, sends them down into the holds of the ships to change the arms to fortifications, ground fortifications. That takes time. And in the meantime, time passes and things are happening. This was a big mistake. It essentially was not only a mistake, it was a violation of the rules of the Japanese or any aircraft battle. 7:10. Because of the delays that the Americans had in putting together their squadrons and the chaos in the air, they told every unit to fly on its own. And that immediately caused the fact that they lost their contact, they lost their azimuth, they didn't know where they were going, and they lost their protection. The escorts were lost because the escorts have the shortest range, they fly the best, they are the fastest plane, but they don't have a good range. So, in simple words, the American torpedo bombers from the aircraft carriers and the American dive bombers reached the Japanese without protection. 7:40. The scout that was late notifies, I am seeing a boat. And I'm seeing 10 boats actually. And these boats, I cannot identify what they are, but there are 10 boats there. Any carrier? No. Nagumo was relieved, supposing that there was no aircraft carrier in sight or within the fighting distance. But the relief was short-lived, as new American attack was reported to be leading in. 7:55, the 26 Midway Marine dive bombers attacked the Japanese. They were decimated again. The Marines had a technique, they flew in, and instead of coming down this way, they came in that way. In other words, they were very vulnerable to the attacks by both the anti-aircraft guns and the Zero fighters. And they were not totally, but only 6 of them were not shot down. No hits again, not a single hit. 8:15, B-17s bombed the aircraft carriers, the Japanese carriers. Again, no hits. Frustrating, isn't it? 8:10, the Japanese scout planes reported that the enemy naval forces is 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. What else? No carrier. Nagumo, at this point, was in quandary. He is asked to provide another bombing of the island. There's no carrier in the vicinity. Why should he worry, or he should worry less? Well, let's bring up the planes that are supposed to hit Midway, the island, again, and then we'll see what happens. And he didn't keep at least one carrier with anti-ship arms, okay? All of them were ready to hit the island. Big mistake. The cap now had to land, refuel, and recharge its batteries. In other words, rearm itself, and even take a break. The planes coming back from Midway are soon to be coming also. The decks are full now, okay? And something has to be done. It's a little crowded on the decks of the Japanese planes. At that point, the scout says, I have a carrier. That changed everything. Because the carrier is a threat to the Japanese carriers. And again, whoever sights them first is the one that hits them first and is the one that has a chance to win. Nagumo changed course into the wind and towards the American carrier. Now he's got his planes ready to attack Midway, and he has to change and attack an aircraft carrier, maybe more than an aircraft carrier. So, at that very point, torpedoes are shot by an American submarine on his fleet. The torpedoes are slow, they are useless. Unfortunately, we know that by now. The American torpedoes at that point were terrible, were essentially non-functional, and they dodge the torpedoes and they go on, and one or two, predominantly one destroyer remains trying to hit the submarine, the Nautilus submarine that fired the torpedoes. The Japanese continue on a different course. The planes coming in from the aircraft carriers don't know that they changed course. So they don't know where the Japanese are. Remember, no GPS, no nothing, no contact. Yorktown at this point launches another group of dive bombers and torpedo bombers. Tamanoga, the group that attacked Midway, is coming in to land. The decks are full. So they crowd as many planes together and they let them land. And now the decks are really overfull. And at this point, he has to change the arms. And he has to change the arms immediately. And he has to do it, he can't send them down back. So he does it on the deck. So the deck is full of fuel, arms, the arms that have been removed, the arms that are being loaded, and it is a total chaos on all the 4 decks of the carriers. And at this point, this was really Nagumo's predicament. His reserve bombers were by then on deck armed, ready on deck to hit the island, but he had to attack the aircraft carrier first. That's the predominant. The whole balance, the whole plan changed in 1 minute. So this time everything was done on deck, and this time literally the one spark will blow a whole ship. The worst was yet to come. 9:20. As the Japanese aircrafts were amassed on deck, fueling, rearming, and changing bombs in preparation for takeoff to attack the United States carriers. Nagumo received report that more American planes are coming, this time from the carriers. Midway gone. There's no more active planes for now from Midway. 9:30 to 10:30, 42 torpedo bombers from all the three American carriers decimated by the Japanese heroes. And essentially, they're coming in without escorts, without protection, and the Japanese themselves, it is documented, the Japanese stood there and said, "This is suicide. We definitely can get them." Because you have to understand that a torpedo bomber literally slides down to sea level, 100, 200 feet above sea level, in order to shoot its propeller, at least its torpedo. And it is, when it is going down, it is in danger, and when it is taking off, it is slow. And this is the fact. Three zeros behind you, you're gone. And almost all of them, essentially all of them, were either shot down, destroyed, or definitely not a single hit from all these aircraft carriers. A total loss of squadrons, of men, of machines, and everything for naught. Nothing, no benefit to the American in the balance of this battle. One ensign, one pilot, was saved, and he was floating. He was afraid to open his rubber boat because he was afraid that the Japanese will see him and take him or shoot at him or whatever it is. And he floated there through the whole battle, saw the whole battle. He became very famous because he had a lot to say, and his picture was on Life magazine. These unsuccessful air attacks laid the groundwork for the American victory. And here is where the miracle occurred. The pilots leading the Hornet and the Enterprise dive bombers were in cahoots. They did not agree with each other. The Hornet pilot said, the Japanese are there. And the Enterprise pilot said, no, they're there. And in the meantime, there's no Japanese, because they lost them totally in the vast Pacific. And at that point, McCluskey, the officer in charge, commander of the Enterprise unit, or squadrons, sees a destroyer rushing in a direction that he thinks that is the right direction to the Japanese fleet. And he follows it. And he he reaches them right over them. There they are, the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. And the aircraft carriers are now finishing off the torpedo bombers that I just spoke about that were totally decimated. In other words, all the aircraft, the Japanese interceptors, all the Japanese cap, if you want to call it that way, are down below by sea level. If they will have to come up to attack the dive bombers, which are flying at 15,000, 12,000 feet, it will take them a long time. Most of them are out of fuel and whatever. So, in simple words, at this point comes the miracle. And essentially, the Hornet dive bombers disappear into the vast Pacific. They end up landing on certain islands, some of them ditched and so on. And at this point, the Yorktown and the Enterprise dive bomber literally meet over the Japanese fleet. And here is the design of a dive bombing. Right? You come up from about 13,000 feet and you dive at the target, making you very, very difficult to hit by anti-aircraft, and very easy to hit your target. And you just have to learn how to get out of there at the right time, otherwise you become a kamikaze, and you fly out. And that's it, and you go home. One bomb. Famous 5 minutes, that's what happened. The Zero fighters that should have been protecting Japan's carriers, Kaga, Akagi, and the Soyo, from high altitude dive bombings, had all been drawn close to the sea level to intercept the slow carrier torpedo planes. The United States carrier-borne dive bombers hurtling down from 12,000 feet onto the Japanese carriers had to be concerned only with anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese carrier decks were at the most vulnerable state, crowded by strike aircrafts being rearmed and refueled, and surrounded by unloaded and standby bombs. Well, the result is 3 of the carriers blew up immediately. One shot, one hit took, and most of them were hit more than once. The series of dive bombs strikes spiked, then sunk 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soyo, in the span of 5 minutes. 3 Japanese carriers were doomed. The dream of success that Yamamoto and the Japanese had literally vanished into clouds. The only ship that remained was the Hiryu, and its commander, Yamaguchi, was determined to take revenge on the Americans. He knew where the Americans were. He immediately moved away. He was attacked by dive bombers and torpedo bombers. He shook them off, and at this point, he launched 2 squadrons towards the one aircraft carrier that they knew about. Through the whole battle at this stage, they did not know that aside from the Yorktown, which they identified, there were 2 other, but they figured it out. Where did all these planes come? But they knew only of the Yorktown. He launches them against the Yorktown. The Yorktown is ready. It identifies the attack. It fights them back, but the Japanese are good, and they succeed in dropping bombs on the Yorktown. First of all, it is hit, but it survives. Then it is attacked again with torpedo bombers, and these torpedoes work. The Japanese torpedoes did work, and the ship is in bad shape. And it is essentially losing power. It is dead in the water. It tilts about 20 degrees, and it is doomed at this point. It will not be the spoons. The commander actually leaves it and passes the command over to his co-commander. At afternoon now, the Enterprise and the Hornet launch anti-Hiryu forces. They reach the Hiryu and they sink the Hiryu. That makes it 4 aircraft carriers. And essentially, this was the final, how shall I call it, gist of this battle. And when I said an opening, luck, practice, coordination, and determination to get in through that crack was essentially what made this victory possible. Overnight, the aircraft carriers, American aircraft carriers, ran away into the east. Why? They were afraid that Yamamoto would pick up speed and try to attack them with his big flotilla. Rightfully so. But Yamamoto, he realized that he was defeated. He gave an order to return back home, Japan. On the following day, the Americans tried to, how shall I call it, give chase after the retreating Japanese with some success, but not much. June 6th, the Enterprise planes actually sank one big cruiser, Japanese cruiser, and seriously damaged another cruiser. On June 7th, Yamamoto sent a submarine to get rid and take the Yorktown completely, and it fired a torpedo that struck the submarine, the destroyer that was protecting the skeleton of the Yorktown. It was empty at that time. The torpedo went through the cruiser and hit the Yorktown. And as the destroyer sank, its depth charges exploded. So it exploded, all its sailors were killed. And when it exploded, it gave the final, how shall I call it, damaging blow to the Yorktown. The Yorktown capsized, and that was it. And that essentially is the finish or the final stage of the Battle of Midway. Okay? Now, we won. But look at the fact that we did win. One carrier sunk on our side, 4 on their side. 98 aircraft lost to the United States. With all that losses, 98 total. 332 carrier aircraft were lost by the Japanese. Not one of them was worthwhile, could be saved. And we lost 300, they lost more than 3,000. That was a big, big loss. They lost their best pilots, they lost their best crews, they lost their pride and their self-assuredness. Jap fleet smashed in all American newspapers. The lost aircraft contributed to the American victory. Their sacrifice was not in vain. They threw Japan's carriers off balance. The United States came close to a defeat in Midway. You know that by now. Nobody else would have told you that. Take somebody who has the bravery and guts to say that as it is. The outcome depended upon Japanese mistakes, United States code-breaking skills, astute planning, good luck, and the heroism of the American fighters. In this battle, America finally established superiority. It was the El Alamein of the Pacific. Japan was beaten but not defeated. From this point on, Japan decided to wage a war of attrition in hope of negotiating peace, continuing. It was a losing situation. The United States began a campaign of reconquest. And at this point, I am done.